Hi everyone, today I want to build a cathedral. After completing my last project here, which is this London Bridge inspired build which spans across my river, I've decided I want to turn my attentions inland to this section on the left of my city, and I thought what better way than by placing in a massive monument such as a cathedral so that we can start building things around it. Whilst I'm flying up here, you can also see that I've begun planning out a couple of the major foundations for things like city walls and towers so that I can begin planning out where things will be going, for example where the cathedral will be going in today's video, but as well as just trying to calculate the space that I have, filling in a few bits and greenifying things and stuff like that. In fact, why don't we head on over to my world map where you can get a better view of what I'm trying to plan out here. So to the left you can see that I've got my city plan, and this is actually a retextured painting if you haven't seen this before, and it's pretty simply just my rough idea of where certain major things will be going, such as the castle walls and things like that, and you can see that I've been trying to sort of recreate them here in person to help me visualize it in game, and you can already see where I've completed the bridge, and the next project isn't listed on here, but it's going to be the cathedral somewhere around here in the middle. And you can see that we actually have the merchants and the noble sections split off by this grey wall. And here you can see where I've already begun planning it out, and what this represents is actually an old city wall, a sort of historical element to my city which will be slightly crumbling apart, and in certain sections like here will even be incorporated into the newer style, which I think will be really cool. It will add a bit of history to the city, and that's going to primarily divide up the two areas. And so since the cathedral I think should be in a more noble area, I'm going to be placing it somewhere around here. Now one thing I've already begun doing is building this creation in a creative world so that I can then come through with a schematic and build it here in survival. Now I don't like to do this with all of my projects, and I'll talk more about why I chose to do it for this build, but the great thing about this is it means that we can now visualize where the foundation of this build will be going. So this is the schematic I've created, and this will be available in the description if you want to get your hands on it. And so what I've decided I want to do first before we tackle anything else is replace all of this stone with grass. I've already begun doing some of it over here, and I just want to do this so that we can create a nice blank canvas to draw on future plans and make foundations like this stand out and just make things look nice whilst putting the rest of this together, as it's going to take me a long time to fill this up with all of the buildings. So as the sun sets, let's get to work on replacing all of this, and then we can move on to building this cathedral. Well, that took a lot longer than I was expecting, but here we are, we've finally finished, and it has revealed the foundations of the cathedral. So now it brings us to my favourite part of building a large creation like this in survival, which is gathering up all of the resources for the build. Now, the other nice thing about using a schematic is you're actually provided with a full material list for everything that you need. And so these are all of the materials that we'll be using to build the section that I have planned for today. And as you can see, it primarily uses a lot of stone. Now, what's cool is that a lot of old medieval buildings would have typically been created with materials that are locally sourced in the area, because it was not practical to transport like tons and tons of rock across the country, and even to this day that can be a pain. And so if there was a lot of limestone in an area, for example, you could expect the buildings there to have a lot of limestone. And although Minecraft is kind of a little bit more basic if you're not playing modded, pretty much everything is made out of stone. But what's cool is that the stone that I'm actually going to be using to build this is the stuff I picked up from that very spot where I flattened the area, so it's pretty appropriate. Alright, well that's about 10 boxes that I've crafted up now, so it's time to crack on. So why did I decide to create a schematic for this thing in Creative beforehand? Well, it boils down to two main reasons. Now the first of those being, it is enormous. Honestly, if I was to try and create this thing, designing it up, going through all of the different changes and edits that you go through in that process, all in survival, it probably would have taken me 10 to 20 times as long just to put this thing together, and I certainly don't fancy that, and I want to make sure I get this out as soon as possible for you guys. But the second reason is that this is more or less designed to represent a historically accurate building that you can expect to see in real life. Now, this isn't designed to represent a particular building, but it's obviously borrowing a lot of the kind of features that you'll find in the majority of them, and I wanted to make sure that when this thing was done and dusted, it actually looked correct. You know, I would hate to have started slowly building this thing up and then find that once I finally got to the end of it, it really wouldn't look right unless I made a massive edit. And in this case, World Edit is your best friend for situations like that. So I know that once I've put in the just absolute immense amount of hours into building this thing in survival, that it will turn out looking how I want it. And you know, when it comes to building sort of the smaller buildings that are kind of not in need of looking a specific way, especially when it comes to medieval stuff, I love building it up in survival, but when you need it to look exactly how you want it, I think this is the best way to go if you have the tools at your disposal. Now, you may notice that early on I actually discovered there were a lot of blocks in between the walls, either ones that just didn't need to be there, or ones that were left over from previous tests and material choices that I had made and then gone back and changed. They were kind of left in there in the schematic, and I chose to kind of hollow it out and make further edits as I was building it in survival. So that was a pretty nice feature. It's really efficiently tuned in now, so when you get your hands on this schematic yourself, you'll know that you're utilizing every single block and you won't be wasting any materials, which is especially nice. So I'm going to finish building up this thing and then we'll take a tour. After hours and hours, I'm so happy to finally say that this part of the cathedral is finally finished. So I'd love to give you guys a tour of what I've made so far, and I thought why don't we walk through the bridge here as we walk under this archway to reveal this beautiful facade for the cathedral, which is now on the skyline. This thing is absolutely enormous. Now you might be thinking right off the bat that this thing is actually maybe a little bit too big. I mean, let's take into consideration as well that we still have all of this back here to construct, but I'm very confident that once I get the rest of the buildings in here, it's not going to look quite so massive. Let's not forget that these buildings are actually a little bit smaller than what would be the standard building around here, and so I think we're just going to let this project cook, and in the meantime we can just admire what I've managed to put together here. So why don't we just take a quick spin of some of the exterior details, as of course that's where things are really happening here. So firstly, on the ground floor we have 3 doors. We've got the main one in the very center here. This is going to kind of open up into the main hall, and then on either end we've got these smaller entrances which kind of connect to the interior passageways, which we'll take a look at shortly. And as we look around the ground floor, I've done my classic moss work down here to age it, along with the cracked stone bricks coming in nicely, so it looks pretty detailed. And you'll also spot up top that there is a little bit more moss where the water's kind of dripping down, and so it's quite weathered, which is perfect for this kind of medieval city. And then as we're looking around, it is very grey, but there's a lot of different shades of grey. So I've got all of the different stone types in here, all of the different textures playing their part, and it's made for quite an interesting and kind of elegant design, if I don't want to flatter myself too much. But I have also incorporated, more so towards the top, my sort of white diorite brick, and I gotta say this texture is just so gorgeous. I don't know what it is, it just looks beautiful. I used to think diorite was horrible, but once I turned it into this brick, it's now one of my favourite textures to use. And so I think I'll continue using this throughout my whole city. Perhaps that'll be like a recurring theme. And then for the roofing, I've used my custom cherry planks. This is a really nice colour to use. You'll actually notice if I just sort of quickly head on up to this top section here, the impact it makes in contrast to the dark oak. You can see that when you look at the dark oak compared to this stuff, it looks really red, and so I'm glad I chose to use this instead of that, as I think that would have just looked a little bit too wooden. And even though this still kind of looks like wood up close, I think the colour works better for this kind of build. And whilst we're up here, we can actually take a quick peek at one of my favourite details. You can see that I've used all of my different skeleton skulls along the roof here to add an extra bit of detail. Now this is of course why I made my mob head farm a couple days ago, or more than a couple days ago now. I was planning on using these in here, and so I finally got all of those I need. The only disadvantage you'll notice as I fly away here, sadly they do unrender from a distance, but to be honest, the same thing happens with my bridge with all of the signs and things. It's just one of those Minecraft things that you have to put up with. And then of course from the back it's looking pretty goofy, but that of course is because this thing isn't finished. So we'll have to just wait and see as we add on the rest of the sections. But you can get a glimpse of the organ up there, the final thing I made in that time lapse. So I think why don't we jump on into the interior and I'll show you what's going on in there. Now it's not entirely finished. Honestly, I think I'd quite like to hear your opinions on what I could put in these towers. I focused a lot more on the interior work towards the future sections of this. These towers I'm just going to call not quite ironed out yet. So they have a couple of details, but they're mostly empty for now. And so this is the staircase. I've got a spiral staircase heading on up for this very first section. And as we make our way up here, it reveals this bit which has the lovely windows with the different types of stained glass that create a kind of cross there, which I thought was really cool. And there's even a couple of new textures that I've added to my texture pack recently, which you can get your hands on in the description. But what I decided to do was, instead of using a staircase which takes up a lot of blocks, a lot of room, I wanted to use something like a ladder here, because if I had a spiral staircase in the middle, when looking through the windows, that's pretty much all you'd see. So I opted for this and I added this kind of metal guard around it, which I think looks pretty cool. But before we head on up there, we're just going to take right, this is a little kind of storage room. This really could be anything. And then this leads us to the center, and this is where the organ is. And so to create this thing, I used a lot of custom banners, and I think it looks pretty awesome. I especially love the daylight sensors on top. They actually look like the tips of the organ, and so yeah, I'm really happy with this design. And then of course in the future, this is going to be kind of a balcony that overlooks the hall that will run down the rest of there. And so why don't we swap over to the other tower as we make our way upwards. So before we go to the very top of this ladder, you'll see that it opens up to another small room, and this is what connects to this section. And so this is kind of like a long balcony along the very front, and this basically just connects the two towers. This is the final spot in which you can actually move from one tower to the other, because from this point we get to basically the roof. And so I especially love this little nook that we have in here. I don't even know what to call it. The shapes and the colors that this has all created is really gorgeous. I think I might need to cover up some of those gray spots in there. But yeah, man, I'm loving this little room. And once this opens up into the rest of the attic, I think it's going to look pretty awesome. But you can see that this is the final bit that we connect. And so once we head on up, we now go into an individual tower. And so this is basically a bell tower. And this is the little bell design I came up with here. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is one of my favorite details. I used a cauldron surrounded by my trapdoors, and look at the beautiful round shape that the feet of the cauldron creates. I mean, this almost looks like a custom model, and yet with the exception of, you know, maybe a custom trapdoor texture, it's completely vanilla, which I just think is so beautiful. And then I've got a little lantern up there, a little table. I'm sure we could add more things, but don't forget, this is kind of like an outside room. So it's not like you're going to have much furniture here. And so yeah, you would ring the bell. And from the outside, you can see that this is sort of what it looks like here. You can see a little bit of my moss dripping down from certain areas. So why don't we move on up another ladder here. This is a smaller, more compact wooden one because we have a little bit less space there. And this leads us up to a second bell. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit more compact, but I really love this room. This is where we were earlier with the dark oak planks. And I love the shapes they create as they kind of bend down into the corners here. I really, really love this room, especially with these cute little windows here. And once again, you can kind of see what it looks like from the outside. And that's about it. That's as high up as we can get, as the rest of this thing is just a very pointy spire. And this is in fact mirrored onto the other side of the tower. And so there's nothing special going on over here. It's just as what we've seen already. And from here, we can start to overlook what will one day hopefully be a beautiful view of the city. We can already see the river from here, so I can't wait to one day revisit this location when we've got a whole load of buildings down there. But there is one more thing that I want to kind of share with you, as I think we kind of skipped over one of the more interesting interior details. So if we head on back into this little room here, as we look up, you'll notice there is in fact a beautiful stained glass window up here. This is very easy to miss, and I'm just going to sort of try and haphazardly fly on up here. You can see that it is very much an odd window as it looks directly into a wall here, but it is beautiful nonetheless, and I've given it the diorite detail trim around the edge. And yeah, it's just one of those things I want to make sure you catch, because you see them from the outside, but it's very easy to miss on the inside. As the sun is setting, you can see some of the light bleeding through the windows, and especially later on when we have more sections with the stained glass, it's going to look really quite beautiful with all those lovely colours coming through. And so yeah, that is about it for today. I have really enjoyed putting this together. It took a long time, but I mean, this thing is enormous. It's probably using up the same amount of blocks as my entire bridge put together. And so I am immediately going to be starting work on putting together the rest of this thing, and I'll catch up with you once I get the next bit done.